I returned home from a classified military deployment just 2 days before Christmas. My 5-year-old daughter Zuri was waiting at the front door crying so hard she could barely catch her breath. Her tiny hands were trembling as she stood in the doorway. She looked up at me and whispered that Daddy said if she let me in, the woman would hurt her again. Then I heard a woman laughing from inside my own house. My name is Jada Washington. I am 32 years old and a cyber intelligence officer for the United States Army. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn your entire world down to protect your child. The winter air was biting, sending a sharp chill through my military dress uniform as I stood on the porch of the home I had worked so incredibly hard to build. I had spent the last 6 months operating in a high-pressure classified environment, running cyber defense protocols that required absolute mental clarity. Through every sleepless night and grueling shift, the only thing that kept me grounded was the thought of coming back to my beautiful daughter, Zuri. I had daydreamed about this exact moment, imagining the warmth of my living room, the smell of pine from the Christmas tree, and the joyful squeal of my little girl running into my arms. Instead, the heavy military duffel bag slipped from my shoulder, hitting the wooden porch floor with a dull, heavy thud. The front door swung open completely, and the reality I stepped into was more disorienting than any combat zone I had ever trained for. Standing right there in the foyer of the house I bought and paid for was Heather. Heather is my 30-year-old sister-in-law. She is a white woman married to my older brother, and she has always carried herself with an unbearable, suffocating sense of entitlement. She always looked at my accomplishments with thinly veiled resentment, unable to handle a successful, dark-skinned woman, outperforming her in every aspect of life. Right now, she was wearing my custom emerald silk robe, a very specific and expensive gift I had tailored for myself during a deployment in Japan. She leaned casually against the doorframe, holding a delicate crystal glass of my expensive red wine. She was smirking at me, looking entirely too comfortable, projecting an aura of absolute ownership over my space. Marcus, my husband of 7 years, stepped out from the hallway and stood directly behind her. He did not look shocked to see me standing there 2 days earlier than expected. He did not look guilty or ashamed of the fact that another woman was wearing his wife's intimate clothing in our foyer. He looked completely cold, detached, and utterly bored. He reached into the back pocket of his designer jeans, pulled out a thickly folded piece of legal paper, and shoved it aggressively directly into my chest. I did not flinch. Years of intensive tactical training teach you how to freeze your physical reactions when you are being ambushed. I slowly unfolded the thick legal document, my eyes scanning the text with the rapid mechanical precision of an intelligence analyst processing raw data. It was a temporary emergency custody mandate. The bold black ink stated clearly that the court had ruled I was suffering from severe, unmanaged, and violent post-traumatic stress disorder. The document legally declared me to be in immediate physical danger to my own daughter. My eyes immediately dropped to the bottom of the page to find the source of this ridiculous claim. I recognized the signature instantly, and it made my blood run absolutely cold. The document was signed by Dr. Eris Thorne, a psychologist who prominently ran the counseling ministry at my mother church. He was not my doctor. I had never sat for a medical evaluation with him. I had never spoken to the man about anything other than the weather during Sunday services. Yet here was his officially signed legal attestation diagnosing me with a severe psychiatric condition I absolutely did not have, effectively stripping away my maternal rights in a single devastating stroke of a pen. "Step off my property right now," Jada Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of any of the warmth or love I used to know. "The court just gave me temporary emergency custody. If you try to cross this threshold, I will immediately call the police and tell them a disturbed, violent veteran is threatening my family." Heather took a slow, arrogant sip of her wine and smiled down at my crying child. I looked down at Zuri, my sweet, beautiful 5-year-old girl. Her small shoulders were shaking violently, her face stained with tears, and her eyes were wide with absolute unfiltered terror. The psychological damage they were inflicting on her in this very moment was unforgivable. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch, even though my combat training could have easily incapacitated both Marcus and Heather before either of them could even reach for a phone to dial for help. Instead, I operated with a completely cold, calculating mind. I scooped Zuri up into my arms, pressing her small face firmly into my thick uniform jacket so she would not have to look at their faces for another second. I turned on my heel and walked back to my car in absolute dead silence. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I refused to let them record me acting hysterical to further their fake narrative. I secured Zuri in her car seat, got behind the wheel, and drove away from the life I thought I knew. The engine roared to life, breaking the freezing silence of the driveway. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, forcing myself to take slow, measured breaths. I had survived hostile territories and thwarted international digital attacks, and I was absolutely certain I would survive this pathetic betrayal. I put the car in drive and accelerated down the street, my mind already shifting from defense to offense. They had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with, and I was going to make them regret it. The drive through our upscale, quiet neighborhood was a surreal blur of twinkling Christmas lights and cheerful inflatable Santas decorating the manicured lawns. In the back seat, Zuri clung to her favorite blanket, her soft sobs slowly turning into exhausted hiccups. My mind was racing, analyzing variables, and calculating threat levels. I needed a safe haven immediately, a place to regroup, and figure out how Marcus had managed to successfully execute this complex legal ambush without me getting a single notification. Naturally, my first instinct was to drive straight to my mother house. In the African American community, the family home is supposed to be the ultimate sanctuary, the fortress where you go when the outside world turns against you. I foolishly believed that a mother's fierce instinct to protect her child and grandchild would easily override whatever complicated marital issues I was currently facing. I thought she would take us in, lock the doors, and help me fight back. I was catastrophically wrong. I pulled into my mother Yvonne driveway. The large house was brightly lit from within, and as I walked up the pathway, the air smelled strongly of her traditional Sunday dinner preparations. The rich, comforting aromas of baked macaroni and cheese, slow-cooked collard greens, and roasting turkey drifted out into the cold winter night. It was the exact kind of cultural meal that usually signaled deep family unity, warmth, and unconditional love. I carried a now sleeping Zuri up the front steps and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The warm air of the house hit my face, but the emotional atmosphere inside was instantly shockingly freezing. My mother Yvonne was standing in the middle of the kitchen, wiping her hands methodically on a floral apron. She did not rush over to hug her granddaughter. She did not smile or welcome her daughter home from a dangerous classified overseas deployment. She just stood there, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and glared at me with an expression of profound disappointment. Before I could even fully explain the nightmare that had just unfolded on my porch, she coldly told me that I had brought this entire miserable situation upon myself. Her voice was sharp and unyielding as she lectured me, saying I had shamefully abandoned my wifely duties to go play soldier across the world, leaving my poor husband completely alone and neglected. According to Yvonne, a woman's true place was keeping her husband happy and maintaining a flawless household, not monitoring cyber threats and protecting national security in foreign countries. She looked me up and down with absolute disdain, and then she actually started praising Heather. She called my white sister-in-law a proper traditional woman who truly understood the importance of a well-kept home and traditional family values. She claimed Heather was simply stepping up to help Marcus through his profound loneliness and stress. It was a staggering, sickening display of internalized misogyny and blatant racial favoritism. My mother was bending over backward to appease and validate a white woman who was actively destroying her own dark-skinned daughter life, all under the guise of traditional church values. Before I could even formulate a response to the sheer breathtaking absurdity of her words, my older brother Trey casually strolled into the kitchen, holding a massive plate of food. Trey was 34 years old and the undisputed golden child of our family. While I had earned multiple advanced degrees, served my country, and built a prestigious military career through relentless hard work, Trey was a flashy, fast-talking real estate broker. He cared infinitely more about wearing custom-tailored designer suits and leasing luxury cars than demonstrating any actual substance or integrity. He was also Heather's husband, making this entire twisted scenario even more sickening. Trey let out a loud, mocking laugh when he saw me standing there in my decorated military uniform, holding my sleeping child like a refugee. He casually leaned against the granite countertop, took a bite of his food, and told me I should just be a good girl and sign the divorce papers quietly. He casually stated that I was causing unnecessary drama and that fighting Marcus in court would completely ruin our family's highly respectable image at their mega church. He actually looked me in the eye and told me to swallow my pride, walk away empty-handed, and let Marcus have the expensive house and full custody of my child, just to keep things peaceful for the holidays. The level of casual coordinated cruelty was absolutely suffocating. I stood silently in the kitchen looking around the room, slowly studying the faces of the people who shared my blood and history. Then a sharp, brilliant glint of light suddenly caught my eye. My mother shifted her weight to reach for a kitchen towel, and the bright overhead recessed lights illuminated a stunning, massive diamond cross necklace resting heavily on her chest. The diamonds were flawless, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the kitchen walls. My military-trained mind instantly processed the visual data and connected the dots with ruthless efficiency. Exactly 3 weeks ago, while I was stationed in a secure bunker overseas, I had received an automated fraud alert on the joint credit card Marcus and I shared. It was a flagged charge for exactly $10,000 at a very high-end exclusive jewelry boutique downtown. When I called Marcus to ask about it, he had smoothly lied, claiming it was a necessary business expense for a high-net-worth client he was trying to secure. Looking at the brilliant stones sparkling against my mother's Sunday dress, the puzzle pieces violently and perfectly locked into place. This was not just Marcus and Heather having a sordid affair behind my back. The betrayal was absolute and total. My own mother and my golden child brother were actively knowingly participating in my complete destruction. They had literally sold me out for proximity to whatever money, assets, and leverage Marcus was offering them. My mother had traded her daughter's safety and her granddaughter's well-being for a $10,000 piece of jewelry to wear to Sunday service. I was not standing in a family home seeking refuge. I was standing completely alone in a room full of enemies. The stifling heat of the kitchen suddenly felt entirely suffocating. I tightened my grip on Zuri, feeling her steady, innocent heartbeat against my chest. Every single person in this room was perfectly fine with watching me lose everything I had built, as long as it kept their fragile, superficial worlds intact. I did not waste my breath arguing or pleading with people who had already calculated my exact price tag. I simply turned around and walked out into the freezing night, ready to wage war. Rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets as I pulled my car into the underground parking garage of a downtown business hotel. It was a highly secure corporate building positioned miles away from my mother's neighborhood and completely off Marcus's radar. I carried Zuri through the sprawling glass lobby, keeping her tear-stained face shielded against my shoulder until we reached the safety of our room on the 14th floor. The space was sterile and quiet, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and crisp linens. It was exactly what I needed. A blank slate, a tactical base of operations. I gently laid Zuri on the massive king-sized bed, pulling the heavy white comforter all the way up to her chin. She stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible about going home before falling into a deep, exhausted sleep. Her breathing finally leveled out, but her tiny hands remained curled into tight fists. I stood over her for a long silent moment, watching her chest rise and fall. The crushing weight of the evening tried to settle over me again. The image of my mother wearing that diamond cross flashed vividly in my mind. The sound of my brother's mocking laughter echoed violently in my ears. I felt the familiar burning sting of tears threatening to break through, but I forced them down with sheer willpower. Grief was a luxury I simply could not afford right now. I closed my eyes, took a sharp, steadying breath, and locked the emotional trauma away in a dark mental vault. When I opened my eyes, the wounded wife and betrayed daughter was gone. The United States Army cyber intelligence officer took her place. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the room and placed my black military-issue duffel bag on top of it. I unzipped the main compartment and pushed past my civilian clothes, pulling out a reinforced matte black Pelican case. My fingers flew across the biometric lock, pressing my thumb against the sensor until a soft green light flared in the dim room. Inside, resting in precision-cut foam, was my operational laptop. It was not a standard commercial machine you could buy off a shelf. It was a heavily modified, fully encrypted terminal, explicitly authorized for accessing secure Department of Defense networks. I flipped the screen open, and the system booted up instantly, requiring a complex sequence of alphanumeric passwords and a secondary retinal scan. The monitor illuminated my face with a harsh, pale blue glow. I cracked my knuckles and stretched my neck, settling into the stiff hotel chair. Marcus thought he had outsmarted me. He truly believed that, because he changed the deadbolts and manipulated a corrupt psychologist, he had completely secured the perimeter of my home. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. Marcus worked in regional medical sales, relying on cheap charm and golf course handshakes. I operated in the darkest corners of the global digital world, hunting state-sponsored hackers, dismantling international cyber threats, and protecting classified assets. He brought a forged paper court order to a digital war. Before I deployed overseas 6 months ago, my security clearance required me to maintain absolute integrity over my physical environment. Handling highly classified intelligence meant my home had to be strictly secure against any potential physical or digital breaches. The military protocol required basic monitoring, but I had gone significantly further. I had personally engineered and installed a state-of-the-art surveillance matrix throughout the entire property. These were not the cheap, bulky security cameras you buy at a big-box hardware store. They were microscopic, high-definition lenses with military-grade audio receivers seamlessly integrated directly into the electrical outlets and smoke detectors of every major room. The living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and our master bedroom were completely covered from multiple angles. The system ran on a closed-loop ghost network completely undetectable to any standard Wi-Fi scanning software. Marcus could have hired the best commercial tech team in the city to sweep the house, and they still would have found absolutely nothing. I routed my connection through 3 separate proxy servers, bouncing my IP address across different continents before establishing a secure handshake with the router hidden deep inside the walls of my home. A green progress bar flashed across my screen displaying the decryption status. It took exactly 42 seconds to bypass Marcus's newly changed internet passwords and re-establish my total administrative control over the entire house. The primary interface loaded, displaying a clean grid of black squares across my monitor. I typed in the final command sequence to wake up the dormant hardware. One by one, the black squares flickered and burst to life, streaming crisp, full-color night vision footage directly from my home. I saw my living room exactly as I had left it, but populated by the people who had just thrown me out into the freezing cold. I watched Marcus pacing back and forth with a glass of scotch, while Heather lounged on my expensive linen sofa, still wearing my custom silk robe. They looked incredibly relaxed, completely certain they had won the battle. I flexed my fingers over the keyboard, preparing to dig much deeper. I did not just want live footage. I needed the historical data to build an airtight case. The system was designed to automatically upload and encrypt footage to a secure remote cloud server every 12 hours. I initiated a mass retrieval protocol, downloading the complete archive of the last 6 months. The massive data files poured into my encrypted drive, automatically organizing themselves by date, time, and room location. I opened the primary timeline matrix to scrub through the captured data. I expected to find exactly what they had shoved in my face at the door. I expected to see the sordid, mundane reality of Marcus sneaking Heather into my bed. I expected to see the undeniable physical proof of their blatant infidelity. That alone would have been enough to destroy them in a conventional divorce proceeding and strip Marcus of everything he owned. But as I selected a random video file from early October and pressed play, the entire narrative completely shifted. The footage buffering on my screen was not just a simple story of a cheating husband and a jealous, bitter sister-in-law. It was something entirely different. The raw, unfiltered audio fed through my noise-canceling headphones, delivering a crystal-clear conversation that made my blood run absolutely cold. The sick, heavy knot in my stomach tightened as I leaned closer to the monitor, realizing the infidelity was barely the beginning of the nightmare they had constructed. I watched the screen as the video from a Tuesday afternoon in early October began to play. The camera, positioned perfectly inside the master bedroom smoke detector, offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the space I had meticulously decorated before my deployment. Marcus and Heather walked into the frame. They were laughing, sharing a bottle of wine, and behaving with the casual intimacy of a couple who had been doing this for months. I sat perfectly still as they collapsed onto my bed, tangling the expensive sheets I had bought for our anniversary. There was no hesitation in their movements, no guilt whispering in the back of their minds. They were entirely brazen in their betrayal. For a fraction of a second, my chest constricted with the natural human instinct of a betrayed wife. But my military training immediately overrode that fleeting weakness. I compartmentalized the betrayal, processing the scene not as a heartbreak, but as raw, actionable intelligence. I hit a sequence of keys, clipping the video file, tagging it with the exact date and time, and saving it to an encrypted folder labeled marital infidelity. But the infidelity was merely a symptom of a much deeper sickness. I continued scrubbing through the archived footage, jumping forward to a Thursday morning in November. The camera feed shifted to the kitchen and adjoining hallway. Marcus was getting ready for work, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the microwave. Zuri was sitting at the kitchen island, pushing a bowl of cereal around with her spoon. Then Heather walked in. She was supposed to be dropping Zuri off at preschool since Marcus claimed he was too busy with morning client meetings. As soon as Marcus grabbed his briefcase and turned his back, Heather's demeanor changed instantly. She snatched the spoon out of Zuri's hand so violently that milk splashed across the granite countertop. My daughter started to cry, apologizing frantically. Heather leaned down until her face was inches from Zuri and delivered a sharp, vicious pinch to the soft skin of her inner arm. The audio picked up Zuri's sharp gasp of pain. Heather whispered something toxic and cruel, telling my 5-year-old baby that she was a whiny little brat who was driving her father away. I watched my beautiful child shrink into herself, paralyzed by fear. The true horror unfolded just seconds later. Marcus walked back into the kitchen, having forgotten his keys. Zuri looked at him, her small chest heaving with silent sobs, holding her bruised arm. She whimpered for her daddy, reaching out to him for protection. Marcus simply looked at her, sighed heavily in pure annoyance, and told Heather to handle the tantrum because he was running late. He grabbed his keys and walked out the front door, completely abandoning his daughter to a monster. The moment the door clicked shut, Heather grabbed Zuri by the wrist, dragging her down the hallway toward the laundry room. She shoved my weeping child inside the dark, cramped space and slammed the heavy wooden door, shutting off the lights. The hidden camera in the hallway captured the sound of the deadbolt locking. Then the agonizing, high-pitched cries of my daughter begging to be let out echoed through my headphones. Heather simply walked back to the kitchen, poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, and casually scrolled through her phone while Zuri pounded on the laundry room door. A primal, violent rage erupted inside my chest. It was a suffocating, blinding fury that made my vision actually swim. My hands shook violently over the keyboard, and a deep guttural sound tore its way out of my throat. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to slam the laptop shut, drive back to the house, kick the front door off its hinges, and inflict catastrophic physical trauma on the woman who had dared to lay her hands on my child. I wanted to tear them both apart with my bare hands. I stood up from the hotel desk, my chair crashing to the floor, and paced the room like a caged predator. My breathing was ragged and shallow. I looked over at the bed where Zuri was sleeping peacefully, her small face finally relaxed in the safety of the hotel room. Looking at her saved me from making a fatal tactical error. If I went back there tonight and let my rage dictate my actions, I would be arrested for assault. Marcus would play the victim, Heather would press charges, and they would use the completely fabricated post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis to lock me away in a psychiatric ward or a prison cell. They would win and Zuri would be trapped with them forever. I stopped pacing. I closed my eyes and engaged the tactical breathing exercises I had utilized before combat operations. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. I repeated the cycle until my heart rate stabilized, and the blinding red haze of anger faded into a cold, calculated focus. I picked up the chair, sat back down at the desk, and turned my rage into a precision weapon. I spent the next 3 hours systematically dissecting the footage. I became a machine, stripping away my emotions and operating with absolute clinical efficiency. I clipped every single instance of abuse, every threat, every physical grab, every moment Zuri was locked in the dark. I matched each incident with timestamps, mapping out a horrifying, undeniable pattern of severe child endangerment. I documented Marcus' blatant complicity, capturing every time he watched the abuse and chose to walk away. I copied the files to 3 separate secure locations, building an impenetrable legal dossier that no corrupt psychologist or smooth-talking lawyer could ever dismantle. They had handed me the exact rope I was going to use to hang them. As the digital folder grew massive, I realized I still needed to uncover the catalyst. Heather and Marcus were arrogant, but Marcus was also incredibly greedy and risk-averse. He would not have gone through the immense legal trouble of paying off a church psychologist to secure an emergency custody order just to move his mistress into the house. Custody battles were expensive, and Marcus hated spending his own money. There had to be an underlying financial motive driving this aggressive, coordinated takeover of my property and my child. I adjusted my search parameters, filtering the surveillance data for any conversations involving money banking or legal documents. The software scanned the audio logs and flagged a highly relevant video file from exactly 3 days ago. The thumbnail showed Marcus and my brother Trey sitting together at my formal dining room table. I clicked play and the screen expanded to show the 2 men in the late hours of the night. The polished, arrogant facade my brother usually wore was completely gone. Trey looked disheveled, sweating profusely, and staring at a large stack of financial documents spread across my table. Marcus was pacing the room, rubbing the back of his neck with a look of absolute sheer desperation. I turned up the volume on my headphones, listening intently as the true motive behind their entire sinister operation finally began to spill out of their mouths. I leaned closer to the monitor as the audio cleared. Trey was leaning over my dining table with his head in his hands. The confident swagger he paraded around our mother and the church congregation was entirely stripped away. He looked like a cornered animal. His voice trembled as he told Marcus that the walls were closing in. Trey Real Estate Brokerage was not the booming empire my mother constantly bragged about. It was a massive hollow shell game. He confessed that he was exactly $500,000 in debt. The commercial leases he had guaranteed were defaulting. His investors were demanding immediate returns, and the federal tax liens were days away from being executed. The luxury cars, the custom suits, the lavish Sunday brunches were all funded by a collapsing pyramid of predatory loans. Trey was facing imminent total financial ruin and likely federal prison for commingling investor funds. Marcus stopped pacing and slammed his hands down on the table. He angrily reminded Trey that he was risking everything to fix this mess. Marcus hissed that if Trey went down, the entire family reputation would be completely annihilated, and our mother would never survive the public humiliation at church. It was breathtaking to witness. The so-called successful golden child was a complete fraud, and my husband was actively conspiring to save him. Then Marcus laid out the actual master plan. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of banking documents. He slapped them onto the table right in front of Trey. It was a commercial loan application for exactly $500,000. The collateral listed on the application made my breath catch in my throat. It was my house. The house I had bought with my own deployment savings long before I even met Marcus. The house that was completely paid off and legally sitting in my name alone. Trey looked at the application and shook his head frantically. He told Marcus the bank would never approve a $500,000 second mortgage without my direct signature, and I was sitting in a secure bunker on the other side of the world. He panicked, saying the bank required a rigorous verification process for active-duty military personnel. That was when Marcus smiled. A cold, dead smile that I had never seen in our 7 years of marriage. He leaned in and told Trey not to worry about my signature. Heather had already taken care of it. Marcus reached back into the briefcase and produced another document. A fully drafted power of attorney granting Marcus absolute total control over my finances, my property, and my legal rights. The signature line already contained a perfect, flawless forgery of my handwriting. Heather had spent weeks tracing and practicing my signature from old greeting cards and checkbooks until she could replicate it blindly. I sat back in my hotel chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of their crime. They were not just stealing my home. They were orchestrating a massive coordinated case of federal mortgage fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud to bail out my brother's failed business. My own family was perfectly willing to leave me completely bankrupt and homeless just to maintain Trey's affluent facade in their social circle. They viewed my hard-earned assets as a convenient slush fund to rescue the golden boy from his own criminal incompetence. My mother knew exactly what they were doing, and she fully supported it because preserving the illusion of her successful son was more important than protecting her daughter's actual livelihood. But Trey was still panicking. He pushed the forged power of attorney back across the table. He argued that a simple forged signature was not enough. He said the bank underwriting department was getting incredibly strict. If they flagged the power of attorney and attempted to contact me through military channels, the entire fraud would instantly collapse. They would all be arrested. Trey demanded a foolproof way to ensure the bank would execute the loan without ever trying to contact me for verification. He said they needed a legally binding reason why I could not be reached and why Marcus had to assume immediate absolute control of my estate. Marcus picked up the forged document and tapped it against the table. He told Trey to calm down and listen. Marcus explained that a standard power of attorney might raise red flags, but an emergency conservatorship granted under severe medical duress would force the bank to comply immediately. If I was legally declared mentally incapacitated, a danger to myself and others, the bank would have absolutely no choice but to deal exclusively with Marcus as my legal guardian. Trey stared at him, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and greedy realization. He asked Marcus how they could possibly get a deployed active-duty cyber command officer legally declared insane without any prior medical history. Marcus leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He said Heather had already laid the groundwork with my mother. My mother had arranged a private, heavily compensated meeting with a professional who was completely willing to look the other way for the right price. A professional who carried enough weight in the community and the local court system to push through a temporary emergency psychological mandate without me ever sitting for an evaluation. "We just need the medical mandate," Marcus said, his voice echoing sharply through my headphones. "Once the judge signs off on the severe PTSD diagnosis, you take the mandate and the power of attorney straight to the underwriter. It will be bulletproof." Trey wiped the sweat from his forehead and asked who was willing to risk their medical license to sign off on such a massive lie. Marcus smiled coldly and spoke the name that made every piece of this sinister puzzle lock into place. Dr. Eris Thorne. The name echoed in my headphones like a gunshot. Dr. Eris Thorne. He was not just any therapist. He was the head of the pastoral counseling board at my mother's mega church. He was a man who stood at the pulpit on Sunday mornings preaching about integrity, moral fortitude, and the sanctity of the family unit. My mother worshipped the ground he walked on, treating his every word as absolute gospel. Knowing that this supposed pillar of the community had casually signed away my sanity and my parental rights without ever speaking a single word to me was a sickening revelation. It perfectly highlighted the absolute moral bankruptcy of everyone involved in this plot. They were all hiding their pure greed behind the righteous facade of the church. I did not waste time dwelling on the hypocrisy. I immediately closed the video player and opened a new encrypted terminal window on my laptop. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to pivot to active digital reconnaissance. I engaged a custom proxy chain routing my connection through secure servers in Frankfurt and Zurich before tunneling back into the domestic network. I was going to digitally dissect Dr. Eris Thorne, and I was going to leave absolutely zero trace that I had ever been inside his systems. I started with the public records, pulling up his state medical license and tax filings. On paper, Thorne presented himself as a humble servant of the community, taking a modest salary from the church and running a small private practice on the side. But a quick dive into the county property databases told a completely different story. I cross-referenced his name against private LLC registries and discovered that the good doctor owned a sprawling $3 million estate in the wealthiest zip code in the state, along with 3 luxury imported vehicles. The math did not align. You do not finance that kind of lifestyle on a pastor's salary and insurance copays. Thorne had a secondary revenue stream, and I was going to find it. I shifted my focus back to Marcus. I already had complete access to our joint checking and savings accounts, but Marcus was far too paranoid to leave a paper trail there. I needed to see his hidden financial footprint. Using a packet-sniffing algorithm I had developed during a cyber warfare training exercise, I isolated the digital breadcrumbs left by Marcus' personal laptop and smartphone over the last 30 days. I bypassed his standard bank portals and dug directly into his encrypted financial applications. Within 20 minutes, I found exactly what I was looking for. Marcus had quietly registered a dummy corporation 3 months ago, listing a vacant lot as the primary business address. I cracked the password on the dummy corporation banking portal with a brute force decryption tool. The ledger loaded onto my screen. The account had been sitting dormant, completely empty, until exactly 48 hours before I arrived home. Then a massive infusion of cash appeared. Trey had liquidated a chunk of his failing brokerage remaining operating capital and transferred it directly into Marcus' hidden account. It was a desperate move, but they needed clean, untraceable cash to execute their trap. I scanned the outbound transactions. There it was. A single wire transfer for exactly $25,000 dispatched only hours after Trey deposited the money. The transaction memo simply read, "Behavioral Consulting Retainer." But the routing numbers attached to the wire did not belong to Thorne Private Practice in the city. They did not even belong to a domestic bank. I locked onto the routing sequence and began tracing the digital path of the money. I cut through standard banking firewalls with the cold precision of a surgeon. I watched the $25,000 move across state lines, bounce through a digital clearinghouse in Delaware, and finally land in a private offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic money laundering maneuver designed to hide illicit payments from the Internal Revenue Service and domestic law enforcement. But against a trained military cyber intelligence officer, it was nothing more than a neon sign pointing directly to the truth. I ran a reverse search on the offshore account holding company, piercing the veil of international corporate secrecy. The holding company mapped flawlessly directly back to Eris Thorne. The entire horrifying puzzle was finally complete. The respected church psychologist had sold his medical license, his ethical oath, and my 5-year-old daughter's safety for a $25,000 offshore bribe. He had manufactured a severe psychiatric diagnosis out of thin air, providing Marcus and Trey with the exact legal weapon they needed to declare me incompetent and steal my home. I leaned back in my chair, the pale blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The parameters of the battlefield had just shifted dramatically. This was no longer a domestic dispute. This was no longer a nasty custody battle or a deceitful husband trying to silence his wife. By executing a fraudulent financial scheme across state lines and international borders using forged legal documents to target the assets of an active-duty military officer, Marcus Trey and Dr. Thorne had crossed a massive line. They had committed severe federal crimes. Because my home was protected under an irrevocable trust, and because I was an active-duty service member protected by the Service Members Civil Relief Act, their little master plan constituted federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy. They thought they were playing a clever game of local family court politics. They had absolutely no idea they had just triggered the full catastrophic wrath of the United States federal government. I systematically closed my terminal windows, engaging an automated scrub protocol that completely wiped my digital fingerprints from the banking servers. I closed the heavy lid of my laptop and reached into my duffel bag. I bypassed my civilian smartphone and pulled out my heavy encrypted military-issue satellite phone. I did not dial a local divorce attorney. I did not call the city police department. I dialed a direct classified line. The phone rang twice before a stern voice answered on the other end. I identified myself using my clearance codes and asked to be connected immediately to my commanding contact at the Judge Advocate General Corps. It was time to mobilize the arsenal. The secure conference room at the local federal building was windowless and intentionally cold. I sat at the head of a long steel table flanked by two people who possessed the exact kind of power Marcus and Trey could not even comprehend. To my left was Major Elias Vance, my direct contact at the Judge Advocate General Corps. To my right sat Special Agent Sarah Miller, a seasoned operative from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. I did not offer them coffee or engage in polite small talk. I simply placed a secure encrypted tablet on the table and initiated the playback of the digital dossier I had spent the entire night assembling. For 45 minutes, the room was absolutely silent except for the horrifying audio of my family conspiring against me. I watched the hard lines of Major Vance's face deepen as he listened to the forged medical diagnosis. I saw Agent Miller narrow her eyes with predatory focus as she reviewed the wire transfers bouncing from Trey, failing brokerage to Marcus Dummy Corporation, and finally landing in Dr. Thorne offshore account. I showed them the forged power of attorney. I played the crystal-clear video of Heather locking my 5-year-old daughter in the dark laundry room while Marcus simply walked out the front door. When the presentation finally concluded, I turned off the tablet and looked at the two federal agents. I did not ask for their sympathy. I asked for their tactical assessment. Agent Miller leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. She looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and absolute disbelief at the sheer staggering stupidity of my husband and my brother. She explained that Marcus and Trey thought they were playing a clever game of local real estate fraud, but they had blindly stumbled into a massive federal minefield. Because I am an active-duty service member, I am strictly protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Any attempt to alter my legal status, seize my assets, or forge my signature while I am deployed is immediately escalated to a severe federal offense. They were illegally targeting a soldier while she was serving her country, which immediately triggered federal jurisdiction. But that was not even the final nail in their coffin. Major Vance opened his legal pad and pointed to the property records of my home. He reminded me of the legal structure we had set up right before my deployment. To protect my assets, I had placed the deed to my house inside an irrevocable trust. Marcus was completely unaware of this maneuver because he never paid attention to my finances unless he wanted to spend my money. By attempting to take out a $500,000 second mortgage on a property held in a federal trust using forged documents sent across state banking lines, Marcus and Trey were not just committing local forgery, they were actively executing federal wire fraud and federal bank fraud. Agent Miller systematically listed the incoming charges with cold precision. Conspiracy to commit bank fraud carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison. Wire fraud carries another 20 years. The corrupt psychologist Dr. Thorne would be looking at decades behind bars for medical fraud, and accepting international bribes. Heather would face severe felony charges for child endangerment and identity theft. They were looking at the absolute destruction of their entire lives. My family had dug a pit for me, but they had accidentally built their own permanent prison. They had handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped case on a silver platter. Major Vance stood up from the table, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape against the floor. He stated that the JAG Corps and the FBI had more than enough probable cause to issue arrest warrants today. He reached for his phone, declaring he was going to coordinate with local tactical units to raid my house, raid Trey real estate office, and haul them all out in handcuffs before dinner. He looked at me with deep concern and said we needed to retrieve Zuri immediately and put Marcus behind bars where he belonged. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to let him make that call. I wanted to see the front door of my house kicked off its hinges. I wanted to hold my daughter right now and tell her the monsters were gone. But my military discipline violently overrode my emotions. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over Major Vance's phone, stopping him dead in his tracks. I shook my head and told them no. A premature raid would ruin everything. If we arrested them today before the bank actually processed the fraudulent $500,000 loan, their high-priced lawyers could argue it was simply a civil dispute or a misunderstood attempt to manage family finances. They might claim they never actually intended to go through with the theft. They could plead down to lesser charges and walk away with probation. I was not going to accept probation for the people who abused my crying daughter and tried to steal my home. I looked directly at Agent Miller and asked her exactly how long the bank would take to process the forged mortgage application and wire the funds into Trey's failing account. She checked the banking schedules on her encrypted phone and stated it would take exactly 48 hours for the funds to clear the Federal Reserve and officially land in his bank. I told them we were going to wait exactly 48 hours. We were going to let Marcus walk into that bank and officially submit the forged documents. We were going to let the corrupt psychologist file the fake psychological mandate with the court system. We were going to let them experience the temporary absolute thrill of thinking they had won. I wanted the transaction to clear completely so the federal trap would snap shut permanently, leaving them absolutely no legal loopholes and no way to negotiate a plea deal. I was going to let them commit the felony in its entirety. I asked for 48 hours to let them hang themselves, and the agent slowly nodded their agreement. I walked out of the federal building and stepped into the crisp morning air. The 48-hour countdown had officially started. The federal agents were tracking the wire transfers and monitoring the court dockets, but for now I had to play my part flawlessly. I returned to my hotel room and immediately opened my encrypted laptop to monitor the home surveillance feeds. Before the screen could even load, my personal cell phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text message from Marcus. The message was dripping with aggressive condescension. He demanded to know why I had not responded to his emails from the previous night. He stated that Trey had run into a minor financial hiccup and needed a quick temporary loan against my house to secure a commercial property. Marcus framed it as a family emergency, insisting that as his wife, I had a legal and moral obligation to help my brother out of a bind. He casually mentioned that he had already drawn up the paperwork to expedite the process, and that I needed to sign the digital documents he was about to send immediately. There was no request, no discussion, just a hostile demand wrapped in a thin veil of fake family loyalty. Before I could even process the sheer arrogance of his text, a notification chimed on my laptop. It was an email marked highly urgent. The sender was a man named Richard Vance, a notoriously sleazy local divorce and estate attorney known for bullying tactics and representing the worst husbands in the city. I clicked open the email and read the contents. It was not a request for a temporary loan. It was a brutal, uncompromising legal ultimatum. The email was a masterpiece of legal extortion. Vance stated that he was representing Marcus in an emergency family court filing. Attached to the email were 3 documents. The first was a quitclaim deed, transferring sole absolute ownership of my Beacon Hill home directly to Marcus. The second was a full custody agreement, surrendering all my parental rights to Zuri, granting Marcus sole physical and legal custody while reducing me to supervised visitation at his discretion. The third document was the weapon they were using to force my hand. It was a scanned copy of Dr. Eris Thorne official psychological evaluation. I read through the corrupt psychologist report, and my blood ran cold. It was a complete fabrication, a character assassination, disguised as medical science. Thorne had diagnosed me with severe combat-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, and violent borderline personality traits. He falsely claimed that my deployment had completely shattered my mental state, making me an imminent physical danger to myself, my husband, and my 5-year-old daughter. He recommended immediate involuntary commitment to a locked psychiatric facility upon my return to the United States. Vance's email laid out the terms with sickening clarity. If I digitally signed the house deed and the custody agreement immediately, Marcus would graciously agree to seal the psychological evaluation and handle my supposed mental breakdown privately as a family matter. If I refused to sign, Marcus would file the medical mandate with the state court, issue an emergency injunction, and have me arrested by military police and forcibly committed to a psychiatric ward the second my boots touched American soil. They were utilizing the oldest, most insidious trick in the patriarchal playbook. Whenever a woman becomes an obstacle, whenever she holds assets or power, a greedy man wants, they simply brand her as crazy. They weaponize her emotions, paint her as hysterical, and use corrupt authority figures to strip away her voice and her rights. Marcus and Trey believed I was thousands of miles away, completely isolated, exhausted by my deployment, and utterly defenseless against a coordinated legal strike. They thought I would panic. They thought I would look at the threat of losing my daughter and being locked in an asylum and instantly surrender my home just to appease them. They believed I was a broken, defeated woman. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need for cash that they never stopped to consider who they were actually dealing with. I was an active-duty cyber intelligence officer. I dismantled international terrorist networks for a living. And these local con artists thought they could intimidate me with a fake doctor note and a sleazy divorce lawyer. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They were perfectly willing to destroy my entire life, my career, my relationship with my daughter, and my freedom just to cover up Trey's massive financial crimes. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient piggy bank and a disposable obstacle. The rage that flared inside my chest was white hot, but I forced it down into a tight, compact sphere. Anger was useless right now. Cold, calculating precision was what would win this war. I sat at the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the ultimatum on my screen. The 48-hour window the federal agents needed was ticking down. If I ignored the email or fought back with an attorney, Marcus might panic. If he suspected I was onto his fraud, he might pull the plug on the bank loan and try to find another way to steal the money, effectively ruining the federal wire fraud case. I needed him to proceed with the bank transaction. I needed him to feel absolutely invincible. I needed him to believe that his extortion had worked perfectly and that I was completely crushed. I stood up and walked over to the bathroom mirror. I stared at my reflection. My eyes were hard and cold, mirroring the tactical mindset of a soldier preparing an ambush. But Marcus could not see the soldier. He needed to hear the victim. I closed my eyes and engaged a different kind of training. I dropped my shoulders, let my breathing become shallow and erratic. I thought about the sheer terror of actually losing Zuri, of actually being locked away in a dark room. I let that manufactured panic bleed into my vocal cords. I took a deep, shaky breath, putting on my absolute best shattered woman voice. I picked up my phone, pulled up Marcus' contact, and dialed the number. The line rang twice before Marcus picked up. He did not say hello. He simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for me to make the first move, radiating the smug arrogance of a man who believed he held all the cards. I let out a sharp, jagged gasp. I forced my breathing to become erratic and shallow, mimicking the exact physiological signs of a severe panic attack. I let a sob tear from my throat, a pathetic, broken sound that echoed loudly in the quiet hotel room. I cried out his name, my voice cracking with manufactured terror. I begged him not to do this. I pleaded with him not to take my baby away, not to let Dr. Thorne file those horrifying papers with the state court. I hyperventilated into the receiver, telling him that if the military saw that psychiatric evaluation, my career would be instantly terminated, and I would be locked in a padded room. Marcus let me cry. He sat in silence on the other end of the line, simply soaking in the sound of my utter despair. When he finally spoke, his voice was dripping with false pity and patronizing cruelty. He told me to calm down, using that slow, measured tone people use when speaking to a volatile child. He had the absolute audacity to tell me that he was doing this for my own good. He claimed the deployment had broken me, that I was sick and erratic, and that Dr. Thorne had recognized the dangerous warning signs. Marcus gaslighted me with masterful precision, stating that he only wanted to protect Zuri from her unstable mother. He explicitly stated that the only way to keep the military police and the psychiatric orderlies away from my hotel door was to immediately sign over the deed to the house and grant him full legal custody. I amplified my performance. I let the tears flow freely, letting my voice dissolve into a series of pathetic whimpers. I asked him how he could destroy everything we had built. I reminded him that I loved him, that I had trusted him with my life. He cut me off sharply. His faux compassion evaporated, replaced by cold, hard extortion. He reminded me of the deadline. He told me that Richard Vance had the digital documents queued up and ready to file with the family court the moment the courthouse opened. He said I had no money, no leverage, and no grip on reality. He told me I was a crazy, hysterical woman, and that no judge in the country would ever believe my word over a respected church psychologist and a loving, concerned husband. I let out one final wretched sob and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. I told him he won. I conceded completely. I choked out the words, telling him I would sign whatever he wanted. I agreed to give him the house. I agreed to surrender primary custody of Zuri. I told him I would do anything just to keep my freedom and avoid being forcibly committed to a psychiatric ward. Marcus let out a slow, deep breath of pure satisfaction. He told me I was finally being reasonable. He instructed me to check my email, open the attachments from Vance, and digitally sign them immediately. But I stopped him. I engaged the next phase of the trap. I told him my hands were shaking too badly to navigate the digital signature software. I played the role of the utterly defeated, submissive wife. I asked him for one single final mercy. I told him I wanted to sign the physical documents in person. I pointed out that it was almost Christmas. I begged him to let me come to the house on Christmas Eve. I spun a pathetic, heartbreaking narrative. I told him I wanted to see my daughter one last time in our home before I checked myself into a voluntary residential treatment facility to get the help he claimed I needed. But I did not stop there. I knew exactly what would secure his agreement. I told him I wanted my mother and Trey to be there. I cried softly into the phone, saying I owed them a massive apology for being such a burden and for always thinking I was better than them. I told Marcus I wanted to formally admit my failures in front of the entire family, sign the house over to him, and say a proper goodbye. The silence on the line was heavy. I could practically hear the gears turning in Marcus' head as his massive ego hijacked his logic. He was a narcissist who thrived on control and dominance. The thought of me, his successful military officer wife, walking into the house on Christmas Eve, completely broken and groveling on my knees in front of Yvonne and Trey, was simply too intoxicating for him to resist. It was the ultimate victory lap. It would publicly validate every single lie he had told. It would cement his status as the long-suffering hero husband who saved the family from his insane wife. Marcus cleared his throat and his voice was thick with arrogant triumph. He agreed. He told me that Richard Vance would print the physical copies of the quitclaim deed, the custody surrender, and the non-disclosure agreement. He instructed me to arrive at the house exactly at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. He warned me that if I tried any sudden moves or brought any military friends with me, Dr. Thorne would instantly activate the emergency medical mandate, and I would spend Christmas strapped to a hospital bed. I whimpered in agreement, thanking him profusely for his generosity. The moment the call disconnected, the physical transformation was instantaneous. The violent shaking in my hands ceased entirely. The manufactured tears evaporated. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and my breathing seamlessly returned to a slow, calculated, tactical rhythm. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. The hysterics vanished, leaving nothing but cold, lethal focus. My face went completely deadpan. Marcus thought he had successfully cornered a frightened, defenseless animal. He believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime using the perfect cover story. He had absolutely no idea that he had just invited an apex predator directly into his living room. The 48 hours would pass. The fraudulent federal bank loan would clear Trey account, triggering the felony wire fraud charges. The trap was set and primed. The battlefield was chosen. I was going to walk into my home on Christmas Eve and burn their entire world to the ground. The day before Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter, biting frost that coated the hotel windows in a thin layer of ice. Inside my room, the atmosphere was entirely digital and highly illuminating. I sat perfectly still at the small desk, nursing a cup of black coffee, my eyes locked on the dual monitors of my encrypted laptop. I had tapped into Heather's public social media accounts. She was not just privately celebrating her perceived victory, she was actively broadcasting it to the world. She had initiated a live stream. I watched in a state of clinical, icy detachment as my husband's mistress paraded confidently through the front door of my Beacon Hill home. She twirled her phone around the foyer, her blonde hair perfectly styled casually, wearing an expensive cashmere cardigan that she had brazenly pulled directly from my closet. She welcomed her followers to her new sanctuary, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She walked the camera through my living room, pointing out the original hardwood floors, the custom built-in bookshelves, and the crown molding I had painstakingly restored. She detailed her grand plans for renovation, explaining how she was going to tear down the load-bearing wall between the kitchen and the dining room to create a modern, open-concept space. She ran her manicured fingers over the imported granite countertops I had paid for with my deployment bonuses, talking excitedly about replacing them with white marble. She was staking her claim, completely intoxicated by the illusion of ownership. At one point, the camera panned past the hallway, catching a brief glimpse of Zuri playroom. Heather casually dismissed the space, telling her audience it would make a perfect home gym once the clutter was cleared out. She actually believed Marcus had outsmarted me and that my home was permanently hers. I watched her twirl in my kitchen, a trespasser playing house, blissfully unaware that she was live streaming from the epicenter of an active federal crime scene. But Heather was not the only one drowning in delusions of grandeur. I switched my tactical focus to the secondary monitor where the digital trail led straight to my mother. Yvonne had never been one to practice humility when she thought she had something to brag about, and today she was in rare, unfiltered form. Through the interconnected web of church community pages and public social media stories posted by her friends, I pieced together the morning events. Yvonne was hosting a lavish, catered pre-Christmas brunch at her house. The uploaded photos displayed polished silver platters, towering floral arrangements, and crystal glasses catching the winter light. In one video clip posted by a fellow choir member, my mother stood at the head of her dining table, holding a mimosa. She was holding court, boasting loudly to the ladies of the congregation about my brother Trey. Trey stood right beside her, wearing a brand-new tailored suit, looking every inch the successful entrepreneur he pretended to be. Yvonne proclaimed to the room that his real estate firm had just closed a massive, highly competitive commercial deal, securing his financial future and elevating the entire family status. She went on and on about his business acumen, his sharp mind, and how incredibly proud she was of her golden boy. She never mentioned my name. She never mentioned the psychological breakdown I was supposedly suffering from, nor the fact that I was allegedly facing involuntary commitment. She was completely consumed by the illusion of Trey's sudden wealth, eagerly soaking up the admiration and envy of her peers. She was bragging about a $500,000 windfall, entirely oblivious to the fact that every single dime of that money was currently being tracked by the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. They were drinking champagne and celebrating a massive theft they had not even successfully gotten away with yet. The sheer arrogance was staggering, but it served my purpose perfectly. Their hubris blinded them to the reality of the minefield they were standing in. The hours ticked by methodically. The winter sun dipped low below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across my hotel room. I remained at the desk, tracking the digital footprints, waiting for the final, critical piece of the puzzle to drop. The trap was meticulously laid, but it required the banking system to finalize the transaction to elevate the crime from a localized forgery dispute to a severe federal felony. I needed the fraudulent funds to physically move across state banking lines. I needed the wire transfer to fully clear the Federal Reserve and officially post to Trey failing business account. The cutoff for large institutional wire transfers was approaching. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with cold anticipation. Then, at exactly 4:45 in the afternoon, my encrypted secure phone vibrated against the wooden desk. The screen lit up with a single highly classified text message from Special Agent Sarah Miller. I picked up the device, my heart maintaining a steady, rhythmic, tactical beat. I opened the message. It was short, precise, and absolutely devastating. She confirmed that the funds had cleared the Federal Reserve and the transaction was complete. $500,000 had successfully wired and posted into the target primary commercial account. The federal arrest warrants were signed, and we were officially green. I read the words twice, letting the absolute finality of the situation wash over me. The loan had processed. Marcus and Trey had officially executed the wire fraud. They had sent forged fraudulent documents across state lines to a federally insured institution, and they had taken physical possession of the stolen funds. The crime was no longer an attempt or a conspiracy. It was a completed, irrevocable federal felony. There was no going back. There was no clever legal loophole or high-priced plea deal that could erase the immutable digital signature of that transaction. The federal hammer was now suspended directly over their heads, waiting for my signal to drop. I locked the phone and slipped it into my pocket. The waiting was over. The battlefield was set. I stood up and began preparing for my Christmas Eve homecoming. Once Agent Miller confirmed the wire transfer had cleared, my very first tactical objective was authorized. I left the hotel room and drove straight to Zuri preschool. Marcus and Heather were so busy broadcasting their stolen wealth and preparing for their grand Christmas Eve victory lap that they had not even bothered to pick her up early for the holiday. Walking into that brightly lit classroom and seeing my little girl sitting quietly in the corner was the single greatest moment of my entire life. When she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, her eyes widened in pure disbelief. I dropped to my knees as she ran across the room and threw herself into my arms. I scooped her up, feeling her small hands wrap desperately tightly around my neck, and I walked right back out the front door. The school administration had my deployment return dates on file, and since Marcus had not yet filed his fraudulent custody papers, there was absolutely nothing legally stopping me from claiming my own child. Now we were safely locked inside my hotel room, far away from the toxic delusions of my so-called family. The room was quiet, a stark, peaceful contrast to the impending storm I was about to unleash upon my own household. I sat on the edge of the large bed, with Zuri settled gently between my knees. I held a soft bristle brush, working it carefully and rhythmically through her thick, dark curls. She was so small, so incredibly fragile, and yet she had endured things in my own house that no child should ever have to experience. She played quietly with a stuffed bear I had brought her, but I could clearly see the lingering shadows of anxiety in her eyes. The trauma of being locked in a dark laundry room by Heather, while her own father simply walked out the front door, had left a heavy, invisible mark on her spirit. She was jumpy, apologizing for small things, waiting for a harsh word or a sudden reprimand that was never going to come. I set the brush down on the nightstand and wrapped my arms around her, pulling her small back against my chest. I rested my chin on the top of her head, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. She leaned back into my embrace and asked me in a tiny, trembling voice if she had to go back to the scary blonde lady. She asked if her dad was going to be mad at her again for making too much noise. Every maternal instinct in my body flared with a protective rage so fierce it physically ached deep in my bones. But I did not let her hear the anger. I kept my voice incredibly soft, incredibly steady, projecting the absolute unshakable certainty of a soldier who has already won the war. I turned her around to face me, looking directly into her beautiful brown eyes. I wiped a single stray tear from her cheek, and I made her a promise. I told her that she was safe now and that she would never be in danger again. I promised her with absolute military conviction that the people who had hurt her, the monsters who had disguised themselves as her family, would never be allowed near her again. I told her that Mommy was home and Mommy was going to build an impenetrable fortress around her. I promised that no one would ever lock her in the dark or make her feel small or raise their voice at her in anger. As I spoke the words, the ultimate justification for my ruthless strategy crystallized perfectly in my mind. This elaborate sting operation, the federal agents, the hidden cameras, the meticulous tracking of offshore bank accounts, it was not just about saving my Beacon Hill home. It was not just about punishing Marcus for his blatant infidelity or Trey for his staggering financial crimes. It was about eradicating a cancer from my life. It was about severing a deeply toxic bloodline to ensure my daughter grew up in a world completely free of their narcissistic abuse. Yvonne, Trey, Marcus, and Heather had all actively participated in traumatizing an innocent child for their own selfish gain. They had targeted my daughter. They had weaponized my motherhood and attempted to use my love for Zuri as a bargaining chip in their extortion scheme. And for that unforgivable sin, there would be absolutely no mercy. I was going to surgically remove them from our lives forever. Zuri looked up at me, absorbing the gravity of my words, and smiled a small, genuine smile that instantly melted the ice around my heart. I tucked her into the hotel bed, pulling the heavy white comforter tightly up to her chin. I read her a story about a brave knight fighting a dragon until her breathing slowed and her eyes drifted shut, falling into the first truly safe and peaceful sleep she had experienced in months. I stood over her for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall, ensuring she was completely settled. Then I turned my attention to the far corner of the room. Hanging silently against the closet door was a heavy black canvas garment bag. I walked over and slowly unzipped the protective cover. The dark fabric parted to reveal my impeccably pressed army dress blues. The brass buttons gleamed under the warm hotel lights. The crisp, sharp lines of the uniform commanded immediate respect, projecting authority, absolute discipline, and unyielding power. I ran my fingers over the heavy fabric, feeling the weight of the metals, the ribbons and the insignias that represented years of grueling sacrifice and honorable service. Marcus wanted a broken, hysterical woman to show up at his doorstep begging for scraps of mercy. He expected a shattered victim wearing sweatpants and crying eyes ready to surrender her entire life just to avoid a fake psychiatric ward. He wanted to humiliate me in front of my mother and my brother, breaking my spirit for their collective entertainment. But the frightened, submissive wife he thought he had defeated did not exist anymore. I carefully removed the uniform from the wooden hanger. The time for hiding in hotel rooms, monitoring security feeds, and tracking digital footprints was officially over. I slipped my arms into the perfectly tailored jacket. It was time to go to war. My Beacon Hill house was glowing with warmth and stolen wealth. Through the front windows, I could clearly see the massive 12-foot Christmas tree Heather had proudly documented on her live stream. It was adorned with silver and gold ornaments, perfectly matching the aesthetic of a woman who had never worked a single day for anything she owned. I stood on the frozen front porch listening to the muffled sounds of classical music and clinking crystal bleeding through the heavy oak door. Inside, Yvonne was holding court. She had invited 3 of her most judgmental church friends, ensuring a captive audience for my supposed breakdown. I could hear her loud, piercing voice echoing from the dining room, bragging about the expensive vintage champagne Trey had provided for the evening. Trey was laughing, a deep, booming sound of pure, unearned arrogance. Heather was playing the gracious hostess, offering catered hors d'oeuvres and accepting lavish compliments on a home she was actively trying to steal. Marcus was standing near the fireplace, soaking in the absolute admiration of his accomplices. He was wearing a brand new tailored suit undoubtedly purchased with the fraudulent bank loan that had just officially cleared his brother account. They were toasting to their own brilliance, entirely convinced that they had outmaneuvered the United States government and a highly trained military intelligence officer. They were celebrating the complete and utter destruction of my life. I did not knock. I inserted my key into the brass lock, turned it with a sharp click, and pushed the heavy door open. The winter wind swept into the warm foyer, cutting through the smell of expensive perfume and roasted duck. The heavy, rhythmic tread of my polished leather combat boots echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. I stepped into the bright light of the crystal chandelier and pushed the door shut behind me with a resounding slam. The room instantly froze. The transition was jarring and immediate. The laughter died in Trey's throat, turning into a choked cough. Yvonne lowered her champagne flute, her mouth falling open in a silent, exaggerated gasp. The 3 church ladies stared in absolute bewilderment, sensing a fundamental violent shift in the atmosphere, but completely unable to comprehend it. Heather stopped mid-sentence, a silver serving tray trembling slightly in her perfectly manicured hands. I did not look like a broken woman. I did not look like a hysterical mother on the verge of a forced psychiatric commitment. I stood perfectly straight, my posture forged by years of rigorous military discipline. The deep navy blue fabric of my army dress uniform was flawless, without a single wrinkle or imperfection. The golden brass buttons reflected the ambient light of the room. My chest was adorned with 3 rows of brightly colored ribbons and commendations recognizing my service in global cyber warfare and active combat zones. I looked exactly like what I was, a highly decorated federal officer walking onto a battlefield she entirely controlled. The visual contrast was violent. Marcus and Trey stood in their expensive civilian suits, projecting a superficial, fragile kind of power built entirely on lies and local bank fraud. I stood in the uniform of the United States Armed Forces, representing the absolute, uncompromising authority of the federal government. Marcus expected a weeping victim. He expected me to fall to my knees in front of my mother and beg for forgiveness while signing away my assets. He expected me to be paralyzed by the sheer terror of Dr. Thorne's fake psychological evaluation. Instead, he was staring at a soldier who looked ready to initiate a tactical strike. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine panic flicker behind Marcus' eyes. His narcissistic brain struggled to process the visual data. This was not the script he had written. The terrified, submissive wife he had spoken to on the phone just hours ago had completely vanished. But his arrogance quickly, violently overrode his common sense. He swallowed hard, adjusting the lapels of his suit, and stepped forward, attempting to reclaim the narrative in front of his stunned audience. He plastered on a patronizing smile, but it failed to reach his eyes. He walked toward the massive marble kitchen island, trying to project an air of calm, unwavering authority. He gestured for me to approach, treating me like a volatile subordinate rather than his wife. "You dressed up for the occasion," Marcus said, his voice dripping with forced condescension. "I suppose that is fitting for a final goodbye. But let us skip the dramatics, Jada. We have guests and we all know exactly why you are really here." He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the counter and pulled out a thick manila folder. He extracted the legal documents Richard Vance had prepared: the quitclaim deed transferring the house, the complete surrender of my parental rights to Zuri, the strict non-disclosure agreement demanding my permanent silence. He slapped the papers down onto the cool marble surface. He produced a heavy gold pen and placed it deliberately next to the signature line. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, with a toxic mixture of hatred and desperate greed. He wanted the money, he wanted the house, and he wanted me gone before I could ruin his perfect evening. "Sign it, Jada!" he commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, uncompromising whisper. "Let us make this quick." I walked slowly toward the kitchen island. I did not break eye contact. I did not tremble. I stopped directly across from him, looking down at the fraudulent documents that were supposed to be my death warrant. Then I looked back up into his desperate, arrogant eyes, and I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that caused the color to completely drain from his face. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket and pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive. I did not reach for the gold pen. I did not look at the fraudulent custody papers or the quitclaim deed. I simply kept my eyes locked on Marcus for one final agonizing second before walking right past him. The heavy silence in the room stretched taut thick with confusion and rising panic. I moved deliberately toward the living room, my combat boots sounding a steady, rhythmic march across the hardwood, and approached the massive 70-inch smart television mounted above the stone fireplace. Without a word, I reached behind the sleek screen and slid the encrypted silver flash drive into the USB port. I picked up the television remote from the mantel. I turned my back to the screen and faced the room. My gaze bypassed Marcus and Heather completely. I locked my eyes directly onto my brother. Trey was still standing near the dining table, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking less like the uniform of a successful entrepreneur and more like a cheap costume. He held his crystal champagne flute in a white-knuckled grip. I pressed a button on the remote, mirroring my decrypted drive directly to the massive display behind me. The screen flared to life, casting a stark bluish glow over the festive holiday decorations. "Let us talk about success, Trey," I said, my voice projecting across the room with the clear, commanding cadence of a military briefing. "Let us talk about the booming real estate empire Yvonne has been bragging to her congregation about all morning." The screen displayed a high-resolution, meticulously organized grid of internal banking ledgers, corporate tax filings, and legal notices. I clicked the remote, expanding the first document to fill the entire 70 inches of screen real estate. It was a formal notice of default from a private commercial lender. "You see," I continued, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace, "when you attempt to execute a massive wire fraud involving federal banking institutions, it attracts a certain level of scrutiny. And when my team began looking into your financial background, they did not find a brilliant businessman. They found a desperate drowning fraud." I clicked to the next slide, a sprawling spreadsheet highlighted in glaring red ink. "This is the actual balance sheet for your supposedly elite real estate firm," I announced, pointing to the screen. "You are completely underwater. You have 0 active development projects. You owe exactly $500,000 to high-interest private lenders who are currently threatening to liquidate your personal assets. You are 4 months behind on the lease payments for that luxury car you parked in my driveway. And perhaps most impressively, you have over $100,000 in unpaid federal taxes." The 3 church ladies who just hours ago had been praising Trey's brilliance were now staring at the screen in absolute horrified fascination. They were reading the foreclosure notices, the aggressive margin calls, and the crippling debt statements. Yvonne's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The champagne flute trembled in her hand as the meticulously crafted illusion of her golden boy was systematically dismantled in front of her most important social circle. I advanced the presentation to the next document. It was a digital copy of the fraudulent loan application Marcus had submitted to the bank, heavily redacted, but clearly showing the requested amount of $500,000. It was the exact amount Trey needed to avoid total financial ruin. "You are not closing a highly competitive commercial deal today, Trey," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. "You were waiting for the federal wire transfer from Marcus to clear. You needed him to steal the equity out of my house, the house I paid for, just to keep you out of bankruptcy court. You conspired to rob your own sister blind so you could keep playing the role of the rich, successful son." Trey's face transitioned from a sickly pale white to a deep flushed crimson. The sheer magnitude of his public humiliation broke through his shock. The facade shattered entirely. He slammed his champagne flute down onto the dining table with enough force to crack the crystal stem. "This is a lie!" Trey screamed, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at the television screen. She is lying. That is all fake. She hacked my accounts and manufactured those documents. She is a crazy, paranoid bitch who has always been jealous of me. He looked frantically at our mother, begging her to buy into his desperate counterattack. Mom, do not listen to her. You know she is unstable. Marcus told you she is having a psychological breakdown. She is making all of this up to destroy me. Yvonne looked completely paralyzed, her eyes darting between the undeniable official bank seals on the television screen and her sweating, hyperventilating son. The church ladies took a collective, synchronized step backward, physically distancing themselves from the imploding golden boy. Trey took a step toward me, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving. Turn that screen off right now, Jada, he demanded, trying to project a physical threat he did not possess. Turn it off, or I swear to God. I did not move. I did not flinch. I just smiled, a cold, empty expression that stopped him dead in his tracks. I am not making anything up, Trey, I said softly. I raised the remote and pressed the center button. The financial documents on the massive screen vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, pulsing green audio waveform. The room plunged into absolute silence for a fraction of a second before the high-definition, crystal-clear audio recording began to play. It was the recording from the hidden surveillance camera in Marcus's home office. Trey's own voice, captured with flawless acoustic precision, boomed from the surround sound speakers. Are you absolutely sure she will not find out Jada checks her credit monitoring obsessively? Then Marcus's voice echoed through the room, dripping with arrogant confidence. I told you I intercepted the bank alerts. By the time the final paperwork clears and the $500,000 drops into your account, she will be dealing with Dr. Thorne's psychiatric evaluation. She will be too busy fighting a mandatory 72-hour hold to notice a wire transfer. Trey's recorded voice replied, a sick, greedy laugh punctuating his words. And the notary? You are sure the signature passes? I traced it myself, Marcus's voice confirmed on the recording. The equity loan is secured. The $500,000 is yours. The audio continued to play, the green waveform pulsing rhythmically on the screen, broadcasting their explicit, undeniable conspiracy to commit federal mortgage fraud directly into my living room. The pulsing green waveform faded from the massive 70-inch screen, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The digital confession hung in the air, absolute and irrefutable. Trey collapsed into one of the velvet dining chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands as the reality of federal wire fraud charges crushed whatever remained of his manufactured ego. Marcus stood completely paralyzed, his jaw slack, the gold pen slipping from his fingers to clatter uselessly onto the marble island. The trap had snapped shut, with bone-breaking force. The absolute stillness of the room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, indignant shrill of my mother. Yvonne stepped forward, her face contorted in a mask of furious desperation. She did not look at her son, the confessed felon. She did not look at my husband, the orchestrator of the theft. She looked at me, her eyes blazing with the toxic, misplaced rage she had directed at me my entire life. She demanded that I turn off the television immediately. She yelled that I was ruining the holiday, that I was putting on a disgusting, classless display in front of her esteemed guests, and that I was deliberately trying to destroy the family out of sheer, petty spite. She commanded me to respect her house entirely, ignoring the fact that she was standing in my foyer, drinking my champagne, while actively enabling the theft of my property. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply turned my icy, tactical gaze away from the broken men and locked my eyes directly onto my mother. The sheer, unadulterated coldness of my stare caused the tirade to die in her throat. She took a half-step backward, suddenly realizing that the dutiful, compliant daughter she had bullied for 30 years was completely dead. I raised the remote and pressed the center button one more time. The screen shifted instantly. The audio file vanished, replaced by a crystal-clear, highly magnified bank statement. I had highlighted one specific transaction in bright, unmistakable yellow. It was a direct wire transfer from Marcus' personal checking account straight into Yvonne's primary savings account. The amount was exactly $10,000. The date on the transfer was precisely 3 days after Dr. Thorne had issued his fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. I gestured to the screen, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that demanded absolute attention. "Let us talk about family loyalty, Mother," I said, the words cutting through the room like a scalpel. "Let us talk about your unwavering devotion to your children." I pointed directly at the heavy, sparkling diamond cross resting prominently against her collarbone. "That is a beautiful piece of jewelry, Yvonne. It certainly catches the winter light. Did the ladies at the church admire it today? Did you tell them the Lord blessed you with such sudden, unexpected abundance?" Yvonne's hand flew to her chest, her fingers clutching the diamond cross, as if she could physically hide the evidence of her complicity. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "That $10,000 transfer," I continued, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the room, "was the exact price of your silence. That was the hush money Marcus paid you to look the other way, while he systematically plotted to steal your granddaughter from her mother. You knew exactly what he was doing. You knew I was perfectly fine. But when he handed you the narrative of my supposed mental breakdown, you did not defend me. You did not ask a single question. You grabbed the check, you bought a necklace, and you actively helped him lay the groundwork for my involuntary commitment." I glanced at the three women from her congregation. Their faces were masks of pure, unvarnished revulsion. They were staring at Yvonne, not with the admiration she constantly craved, but with profound disgust. The pious, morally superior matriarch they thought they knew had just been exposed as a woman who would sell her own flesh and blood for a shiny trinket and a few fleeting moments of suburban prestige. The illusion of her grand, respectable life was being incinerated in front of her most important peers. "You sat in the front pew every Sunday," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, "preaching about grace and family values, while you actively aided a conspiracy to lock your own daughter in a psychiatric ward so your golden boy could pay off his loan sharks. You traded my freedom and Zuri's safety for $10,000. You are not a matriarch, Yvonne. You are an accomplice." Yvonne stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa, her face drained of all color. She looked around the room, seeking an ally, seeking anyone who would validate her, but she found only averted eyes and crushing judgment. She was utterly destroyed, her social standing and false piety burned to ash in seconds. She sank onto the cushions, looking like a deflated, fragile shell of the tyrant she used to be. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. The room felt like a graveyard of shattered egos. But the delusion in that space had not yet been completely eradicated. From the far side of the kitchen island, Heather stepped forward. She crossed her arms over her chest, puffing herself up in a pathetic attempt to project toughness and defend the crumbling empire she thought she was inheriting. She was wearing my clothes, standing in my kitchen, and she still believed she held the upper hand. She glared at me, her voice shrill and dripping with unearned entitlement. She told me I was completely unhinged. She called me a crazy, paranoid woman and stated loudly that I was proving Marcus right, that I desperately needed to be locked up before I hurt someone and ruined everyone's lives. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto the mistress playing house. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute tactical anticipation. "I was hoping you would speak up, Heather." I did not break eye contact with her as my thumb hovered over the heavy plastic of the remote control. Heather stood there in a stolen designer dress, occupying my home, drinking my wine, entirely convinced that she was the victor in a game I had not even begun to play. She thought her superficial youth and Marcus' hollow promises provided her with an impenetrable shield. She thought she was untouchable. I pressed the center button. The massive screen flared instantly, replacing the damning financial records with a live, crystal-clear 4K video feed. The footage was pulled directly from the concealed security camera I had meticulously tucked inside the living room bookshelf weeks ago. The timestamp pulsing in the bottom right corner displayed a date from exactly 12 days prior. The location on the screen was the exact room we were currently standing in. The high-definition video showcased Marcus and Heather. They were not discussing business. They were violently, undeniably entangled on the expensive cream-colored sectional sofa directly behind where Yvonne was currently sitting. The audio was pristine, broadcasting their breathless, illicit promises to each other with agonizing clarity. Heather's voice echoed from the surround sound speakers, laughing a high, cruel laugh as she mocked my supposed mental instability. On the recording, she loudly discussed how perfectly they were going to redecorate my house once I was locked away in a psychiatric ward and how easy it would be to replace me. The three church ladies gasped in unison, a sharp, synchronized intake of breath that sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. One of the women physically covered her eyes, turning her head entirely away from the 70-inch display of pure, unadulterated moral bankruptcy. Yvonne, already decimated by the exposure of her own hush money, let out a choked cry and recoiled from the sofa as if the cream-colored upholstery itself had suddenly caught fire. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. He turned his face toward the hardwood floor, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. The undeniable reality of his infidelity broadcast in cinematic quality to his mother and her most judgmental gossip-hungry peers stripped away his very last shred of dignity. He was no longer the successful, respectable family man. He was a disgraced, cheating fraud. Heather froze completely. The arrogant, triumphant smirk melted off her face in real time, replaced by a sickly, chalky pallor. Her jaw dropped open. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes darting from face to face, desperately searching for a sympathetic gaze, an ally, a way to somehow spin the undeniable visual evidence playing behind me. But there was no escape. She was exposed as a predator, a homewrecker who had actively participated in a plot to destroy another woman just to steal her life. I paced slowly toward her, the polished leather of my boots thudding a steady, intimidating rhythm against the floorboards. "You thought you were moving into a turnkey life, Heather," I said, my voice projecting with lethal calm. "You thought you could simply replace me, take my daughter, spend my money, and play the role of the devoted new wife. But you are not a wife. You are a parasite." I did not let the shock settle. I did not give her a single second to formulate a defense or attempt to redirect the blame. I raised the remote and clicked to the final, most devastating file on the encrypted drive. The illicit living room scene vanished. The screen shifted immediately to the narrow, brightly lit corridor leading to the laundry room. The timestamp indicated a Tuesday afternoon, a day Marcus claimed he had been working from home and watching Zuri while I was running errands. But Marcus was nowhere to be seen on the screen. Instead, the footage showed Heather gripping my 5-year-old daughter aggressively by the upper arm. Zuri was crying. Her small face was streaked with tears, her tiny fingers clutching a broken purple crayon. Heather leaned down, her face twisting into an ugly, malicious snarl that completely erased her superficial beauty. The sensitive microphone picked up her venomous whisper with horrifying clarity. She told Zuri to stop whining immediately or she would give her a real reason to cry. Then the high-definition camera captured the exact moment Heather's fingers dug viciously into Zuri's small shoulder, executing a sharp, cruel, sustained pinch. Zuri shrieked in sudden, sharp pain, trying desperately to pull away from the taller woman. Heather did not let go. Instead, she shoved my terrified, crying child into the dark, windowless laundry room. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and engaged the deadbolt lock from the outside. The camera watched as Heather casually checked her phone, typed a text message, and walked away. The muffled, panicked, agonizing cries of my 5-year-old daughter begging to be let out echoed through the silence of my living room. The atmosphere in the house instantly shifted from stunned shock to pure, unadulterated hostility. This was no longer just about financial fraud or suburban infidelity. This was about the deliberate, malicious torture of an innocent child. The church ladies were murmuring in horrified outrage, stepping toward the door to distance themselves from the monsters in the room. Even Trey, nursing his own shattered ego and impending federal charges, looked at Heather with a mixture of profound disgust and horror. Marcus stared at the screen, his face completely blank the reality of what he had allowed into his home, finally penetrating his narcissistic delusion. I closed the distance between Heather and myself until we were standing mere inches apart. The tactical, disciplined calm I had maintained all morning was rapidly burning away, replaced entirely by the lethal, uncompromising instinct of a mother who had just watched her child be abused. "You put your hands on my daughter," I stated. My voice dropped to a terrifying guttural whisper that carried far more menace than any scream ever could. "You locked my terrified 5-year-old child in a dark room because she annoyed you." I did not even look at my husband, but my voice lashed out to strike him where he stood. "And you, Marcus, you brought this abusive sociopath into my house and left her alone with Zuri while you were busy plotting to steal my equity." The absolute suffocating weight of her complete exposure finally broke Heather. She was cornered. There was no lie left to tell, no manipulative tears that could erase the digital evidence playing on a continuous loop behind me. The superficial facade shattered into a million pieces, revealing the unhinged, violent reality underneath. She was being stripped of her borrowed wealth, her fake prestige, and her fabricated innocence, and she was facing the terrifying reality of a mother wrath. A primal, wordless shriek tore from Heather's throat. Her eyes went wide and totally manic, darting desperately around the pristine kitchen. Her frantic gaze locked onto a heavy crystal red wine glass sitting near the edge of the marble island. Driven by pure, humiliated rage and the absolute, undeniable destruction of her entire future, her hand shot out. She grabbed the thick stem of the glass, her knuckles turning bone white. With a guttural scream that echoed violently off the high ceilings, Heather raised the heavy crystal and launched herself directly at my face. The heavy crystal arched through the air, aimed directly at the bridge of my nose. Time seemed to drastically dilate. To Heather, fueled by a cocktail of absolute humiliation and desperate hysteria, her attack must have felt blindingly fast. To a trained military intelligence officer who had run countless close-quarters combat drills, her movement was agonizingly slow, sloppy, and entirely predictable. She expected a terrified civilian. She expected me to flinch, to raise my arms in a defensive panic, or to scream and back away. She was gambling on the manufactured narrative that I was a broken, unstable woman, incapable of defending herself. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stepped diagonally, slipping effortlessly inside the clumsy telegraphed arc of her swing. My left hand snapped upward, closing around her wrist with an unforgiving iron grip that stopped her forward momentum instantly. My right hand clamped firmly over her elbow. Using her own chaotic kinetic energy against her, I twisted her arm sharply, applying immediate and agonizing torque to the joint. Heather let out a piercing shriek as her fingers involuntarily sprang open. The heavy crystal wine glass dropped from her grasp, hitting the polished hardwood floor and shattering into 100 glittering, jagged shards. I did not pause to let her register the pain. Fluidly, brutally, I pivoted my hips and drove her downward. Gravity and leverage did all the work. Heather went flying forward, slamming chest first onto the hardwood with a heavy, breathless thud. Before she could even attempt to push herself back up, I dropped my weight, planting my knee securely between her shoulder blades to pin her flat against the floor. I wrenched her right arm up behind her back, locking it into a strict textbook submission hold. The angle was calculated and precise, applying exactly enough pressure to completely immobilize her without snapping the bone. The physical contrast was absolute. Heather thrashed beneath me, a pathetic, writhing mess of stolen silk and frantic panic. Her expensive, manicured fake nails scrabbled uselessly against the smooth wood, searching for purchase she would never find. She was sobbing uncontrollably, a high-pitched wail of pure humiliation, physical discomfort, and the terrifying realization that she was utterly powerless. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled bird nest across her face, her cheek pressed hard against the cold floorboards. I, on the other hand, was perfectly still. My breathing was slow, even, and measured. My heart rate had barely spiked. I had spent years in rigorous training environments, learning to neutralize active physical threats. A civilian playing house and throwing a tantrum was not a fight. It was barely an inconvenience. I maintained the lock, feeling the frantic, rapid flutter of her pulse beneath my knee. I leaned down, bringing my face just inches from her ear. The room was ringing with the echoes of her sudden defeat, but I knew she could hear me perfectly. "Do not touch government property," I whispered, my voice colder than the freezing wind outside. The silence that descended upon the room was thick and suffocating, broken only by the pathetic sound of Heather whimpering and the crunch of broken crystal under my boots. The three women from my mother congregation were huddled tightly together near the dining table, their hands clamped over their mouths in sheer, unadulterated terror. They had arrived expecting a civilized holiday brunch filled with gossip and expensive champagne. Instead, they had witnessed the undeniable exposure of severe child abuse, followed immediately by a flawless, violent tactical takedown. Yvonne was hyperventilating, clinging to the edge of the marble kitchen island for dear life. Her prized diamond cross swung erratically against her chest as she stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. She was watching the daughter she had always bullied and underestimated physically dominate the woman who had helped steal her granddaughter. Trey had backed himself entirely into the far wall, pressing his spine against the expensive wallpaper as if desperately trying to merge with the drywall. He looked at me with pure terror, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. The woman standing in front of him was not just a digital threat who could ruin his fake real estate empire. She was a physical force of nature who could dismantle his entire world. Then Marcus finally moved. The physical subjugation of his mistress seemed to snap him out of his catatonic shock. But instead of showing an ounce of remorse for the abuse of his daughter or the theft of my home, his narcissistic brain immediately sought a way to regain control. He needed to flip the script to reclaim his lost authority and to cast me back into the role of the unstable aggressor. He patted his suit pockets frantically, pulling out his smartphone with shaking hands. His face contorted into a mask of righteous manufactured outrage. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project a dominance he had entirely lost. "Get off of her," Marcus roared, taking a hesitant step forward, but wisely keeping his distance from my striking range. "You are completely out of your mind, Jada. This is assault. You broke into my house, you threatened my family, and now you are violently attacking my guest." He held his phone up like a shield, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen, desperately clinging to the illusion that he was still the man in charge. "I am calling the police right now," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "I am having you arrested for battery and trespassing. You are going to be locked in a cell before they transfer you to the psych ward. You are finished." I looked down at Heather, who had stopped thrashing and was now just quietly crying into the floorboards, completely defeated. She posed zero tactical threat. I released the pressure on her wrist and stood up in one fluid, controlled motion. I stepped back, my combat boots crunching over the shattered remains of the crystal glass. I stood perfectly straight in the center of the room. I reached down and calmly smoothed the navy blue fabric of my army dress uniform jacket, ensuring it fell perfectly flat across my chest. I adjusted my golden brass cuffs, completely ignoring the sobbing woman scrambling clumsily to her feet behind me. I turned my icy gaze to Marcus, watching his trembling thumb hover over the emergency dial button on his glowing screen. "Don't bother dialing," I said. I stepped away from Heather and moved closer to the marble kitchen island. I rested my hands flat against the cool stone and tilted my head, watching Marcus as his thumb hovered over the glowing screen of his smartphone. His chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was desperately clinging to the delusion that he still possessed some form of authority, that he could dial 3 numbers and have the local police haul me away like a common criminal. I said, "Do not bother dialing Marcus." I repeated, my voice dropping to a low conversational tone that carried absolute authority. "If you call the local Boston police for a domestic dispute, you are going to be severely disappointed by who actually shows up to answer the call. You see, you made a fundamental catastrophic miscalculation when you drafted your little master plan." I walked slowly around the island, putting myself directly between Marcus and the front door. "You thought you were committing a simple, neat little white-collar crime," I explained. gesturing toward the television screen that still displayed the frozen frame of Heather abusing my daughter. You thought you could pay Richard Vance to forge a general power of attorney, use it to bypass my signature, and quietly siphon $500,000 out of our marital property to save your brother's failing business. You thought it was a family matter, a civil dispute at best. You thought you outsmarted a woman who was too heavily medicated and emotionally unstable to fight back. Marcus swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to my face. The sheer terror of the unknown was beginning to override his arrogance. "The house is in both our names, Jada," he stammered, his voice lacking any of its previous conviction. "I have marital rights. I just needed the cash temporarily. I was going to pay it back." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, cutting through the tension like a blade. "The house is not in both our names, Marcus," I stated plainly. "It has not been in my name for over 3 years." That statement hit him with the force of a physical blow. His brow furrowed in utter confusion. Trey, still pinned against the dining room wall, let out a choked gasp. "Let us talk about basic asset protection." I continued, folding my arms across my chest. Before my last classified deployment to Eastern Europe, I knew the statistical risks of my profession. I knew I needed to guarantee absolute financial security for Zuri in the event that I did not come home, so I did not just leave a standard will. I executed a complete transfer of assets. I removed my personal name from the deed of this Beacon Hill property and placed it entirely into a blind, federally monitored, irrevocable trust. Zuri is the sole beneficiary. I am merely the managing trustee. The color completely drained from Marcus' face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He was a man who understood finance, and he instantly comprehended the fatal error he had just made. He had not checked the chain of title properly. He had relied on old documents and his own supreme arrogance. "A general power of attorney," I explained, delivering the lecture with the precise, uncompromising cadence of a military instructor, "is completely legally void when attempting to borrow against an irrevocable trust. You cannot use a spousal POA to override a designated federal trustee. But you were greedy. You were in a rush to beat the clock before I returned from my supposed psychiatric evaluation. You pushed the paperwork through a careless loan officer who did not verify the trust provisions." "It was just a mistake," Marcus whispered, his phone slipping from his sweaty grip to clatter against the hardwood floor. "The bank approved it. They sent the money." "They did send the money," I agreed, my eyes locked onto his terrified face. "And that brings us to the real problem, Marcus. Because the property is held in a federal trust, the moment you submitted that forged signature, you did not just lie to your wife. You defrauded a federally insured banking institution. You triggered an automatic internal audit. My clearance level guarantees that any irregular activity regarding my trust is immediately flagged by federal intelligence." I turned my attention to Trey, who was actively hyperventilating, his hands clutching his chest. "The $500,000 loan was not handed to you in a briefcase, Trey," I said, raising my voice to ensure every person in the room absorbed the reality of their situation. "It was processed digitally. The funds were wired from a Federal Reserve Bank in New York straight across state lines directly into the corporate account of your shell company here in Massachusetts." Yvonne let out a loud, piercing wail, finally understanding the catastrophic trap her sons had walked blindly into. Heather, still huddled on the floor amidst the broken crystal, stopped crying, entirely frozen in a state of absolute paralyzing dread. "Do you know what happens when you use forged documents to transfer illicit funds across state lines via electronic banking networks?" I asked, looking back at my husband. "It ceases to be a local fraud case. It becomes a matter of federal jurisdiction." I took one final step toward Marcus, reciting the statutes from memory. Title 18, United States Code Section 1343, Federal Wire Fraud. Title 18, United States Code Section 1344, Federal Bank Fraud. You did not commit a simple family indiscretion, Marcus. You and your brother executed a coordinated multi-state federal crime against the United States government. Each count carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in a federal penitentiary and a $1 million fine. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The sheer crushing weight of the federal government had just been dropped directly onto their suburban holiday party. Marcus' legs gave out. He stumbled backward and collapsed heavily onto one of the velvet bar stools, his mouth hanging open in silent, horrified disbelief. Trey was weeping openly now, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, clutching his knees to his chest. Yvonne was rocking back and forth on the sofa, praying in frantic, terrified whispers. They realized all at once that their lives were completely over. There was no clever lawyer who could undo a completed federal wire transfer. There was no charming lie that could erase the digital footprints they had clumsily left across the banking system. They had handed the evidence directly to a military intelligence officer who knew exactly how to use it. I looked down at the gold watch on my left wrist. The timing was flawless. I had not come to this house to argue with them. I had not come to physically fight Heather or to beg for my daughter back. I had come to stall them. I had come to keep them in this room perfectly distracted by their own egos until the wire transfer completely cleared the Federal Reserve Network, permanently sealing their guilt. The crime was now fully executed. It was documented. It was reported. Suddenly, the warm, ambient lighting of the living room was violently overridden. Brilliant strobing flashes of intense red and blue light pierced through the sheer curtains of the front windows, painting the terrified faces of my family in rapid, chaotic bursts of neon color. The heavy, unmistakable synchronized sound of tactical boots hit the frozen wooden planks of the front porch. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Open the door. The command was not a request. It was a booming, authoritative roar that vibrated through the floorboards of the foyer. Before Marcus could even process the words, the heavy mahogany front door violently splintered inward. The expensive brass deadbolt snapped like a brittle twig under the force of a tactical battering ram. A flood of dark gear, Kevlar vests, and matte black rifles poured into the entryway. There were at least a dozen agents, a highly coordinated mixed task force of FBI operatives and military police officers. Their sudden, overwhelming presence instantly consumed the available space, bringing the freezing winter wind and the absolute uncompromising authority of the federal government directly into the pristine living room. They did not pause. They did not ask for permission to secure the premises. They moved with a terrifying liquid efficiency, and they completely bypassed me. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my posture rigid, my feet planted shoulder-width apart, and my hands clasped loosely behind my back in parade rest. I was a silent, immovable observer in my own home. The lead agents swept past my navy blue dress uniform without offering me a single glance, their eyes locked intensely onto their designated targets. The sheer kinetic energy of the raid was absolute. Commands were shouted with deafening, overlapping volume designed to completely disorient and dominate any potential resistance. Two massive federal agents descended directly on Marcus. The arrogant patriarch of the house, the man who believed his tailored suit and sophisticated corporate vocabulary made him untouchable, was violently shoved face first against the custom-textured wallpaper. The heavy thud of his body hitting the wall violently rattled the framed family photographs hanging nearby. Marcus attempted to use his executive voice, frantically stammering that there was a massive misunderstanding, that he was a respected property owner, and that he demanded to call his attorney immediately. An agent sharply kicked Marcus' legs apart, forcing him into a wide, humiliating, submissive stance, before roughly jerking his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed brutally over his frantic, breathless protests. Trey did not even attempt to stand his ground. The exact moment the front door had splintered, the remaining color drained from his face, and he had curled into a pathetic, trembling ball against the baseboards. An agent grabbed him by the collar of his expensive, festive holiday sweater, hauling him upright like a rag doll. Trey was weeping openly, tears and snot streaming unashamedly down his face. He babbled incoherently, his voice pitching into a panicked squeal as he immediately volunteered to cooperate. He offered to turn state evidence on the spot, screaming at the top of his lungs that the entire fraud scheme, the shell company, and the forged documents were entirely his brother's idea. He sold Marcus out to the federal agents before they had even finished securing his wrists. Heather fared no better in the chaos. She was still sitting on the floor amidst the shattered crystal wine glass, completely disoriented from the physical takedown I had just delivered. Two female military police officers marched forward and hauled her to her feet by her armpits. Heather immediately began to thrash, shrieking at the top of her lungs that she was the victim, that I had brutally assaulted her, and that she was the lady of the house. The military officers were completely unimpressed by her stolen designer dress or her manic, entitled hysterics. They slammed her firmly against the edge of the marble kitchen island. One officer efficiently pinned Heather's shoulder to the cold stone, while the other clamped cold steel around her wrists, effectively silencing her frantic demands with the harsh reality of an arrest. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a voice that commanded absolute compliance, stepped into the center of the devastated living room. He unfolded a thick stack of federal warrants. He did not read them quietly. He projected his voice so that every single person present, including the terrified neighbors, undoubtedly watching from their front lawns, would hear exactly what was happening. He formally charged Marcus and Trey with conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, interstate wire fraud, and identity theft. He then turned his undivided attention to Heather. He read a separate warrant that charged her as a direct accessory to federal financial fraud, and he loudly added a devastating state charge of felony child endangerment. The scene was a masterpiece of total degradation. The three church ladies from Yvonne's congregation were backed into the furthest corner of the dining room. They were clutching each other's arms, their faces pale masks of sheer, unadulterated horror. The festive holiday decorations, the sparkling Christmas tree, and the expensive catering laid out on the counter stood in grotesque, mocking contrast to the tactical raid taking place. The prominent members of their suburban social circle were watching the golden boy and his mistress being processed like violent street criminals. Marcus' expensive suit jacket was bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. Heather's designer dress was stained with tears and dust from the floorboards. Trey was hyperventilating so hard his knees buckled. The agents began the extraction. They did not march them out with dignity. They aggressively marched the three of them toward the shattered front door. Marcus struggled against the iron grip of the agents, his eyes frantically searching the room until they finally landed on me. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and total disbelief. His jaw worked silently, unable to process how the compliant, quiet wife he thought he could easily discard had systematically orchestrated his complete, irreversible annihilation. I stared back at him with a blank, unreadable expression. I offered no smile, no gloating remark, and no sympathy. I simply watched the inevitable, calculated consequence of his actions play out to its logical conclusion. As Marcus and Trey were roughly hauled across the threshold and pulled out into the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the freezing front lawn, the very last pillar of their fraudulent empire finally collapsed. Yvonne, who had been completely paralyzed by the shock of the raid, let out a ragged, soul-tearing sob. Her golden children, her entire source of pride and suburban prestige, were being taken away in chains to face federal prison. She stumbled forward, her legs failing her entirely. She crashed to her knees right in front of me. Her hands shot out, her trembling fingers grabbing desperately at the crisp, tailored fabric of my uniform skirt. Yvonne's grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by the primal animalistic panic of a matriarch watching her entire meticulously curated dynasty incinerate before her very eyes. Her manicured nails, painted a festive holiday crimson, dug fiercely into the heavy navy wool of my skirt. She pulled the fabric taut, using my uniform as a physical anchor to keep herself from completely collapsing into the abyss of her own making. She was looking up at me from her knees, her face completely stripped of the arrogant, pious superiority she had worn like impenetrable armor for the last 30 years. Mascara ran in dark, muddy rivers down her cheeks, pooling in the fine lines around her mouth. Her lips formed an ugly, trembling shape as she gasped for air, her chest heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "Jada, please!" She choked out her voice, a ragged, desperate wheeze that sounded entirely foreign coming from her usually commanding throat. Please, you have to stop them. You have to go out there right now and tell those men to stop. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the transfer. Tell them it was just a terrible mistake between a husband and a wife. You can fix this. You have to fix this. She was literally begging me to walk out onto my own front lawn and lie to federal agents. She wanted me to commit perjury to save the men who had just spent weeks actively conspiring to destroy my life, steal my property, and lock me in a psychiatric ward. The sheer staggering audacity of her request was breathtaking. It perfectly encapsulated the twisted reality she lived in, a reality where my suffering was always an acceptable price to pay for the preservation of her golden boys. I did not try to pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, waiting for a spark of empathy that never came. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, no sorrow. Just a cold, sterile void where a daughter affection should have resided. It is just money, Jada. Yvonne pleaded, her fingers twisting tighter into my uniform, her knuckles turning white. We can get the money back. Marcus can pay you back. I will pay you back. But you cannot let them do this. You can fix this. You are an officer. They will listen to you. Just say Marcus had your permission. Just say you forgot you signed the paper. Please, God, please. Trey cannot go to federal prison. You know how he is. He is too sensitive. He is soft. He will not survive in a place like that. They will kill him in there. She wept for Trey. She wept for a 30-something-year-old man who had happily procured fraudulent psychiatric evaluations to ensure I lost custody of my own child so he could pay off his loan sharks. She cried for his softness, completely ignoring the diamond-hard calculated cruelty he had deployed against me. She begged for mercy for the predators while standing in the house where her innocent granddaughter had been locked in a dark room. Think of the family, Jada, Yvonne sobbed, playing the only card she believed she had left, the exact same card she had used to manipulate and control me my entire life. Think of our reputation. Think of what this will do to us. You cannot let them drag your brothers and your husband away in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood. The whole street is watching. It will ruin us. The church will never look at us the same way. You are destroying your own family over money and spite. I slowly lowered my gaze, letting my eyes drop from her weeping, desperate face to the heavy, sparkling diamond cross dangling from her neck. The pristine gems caught the chaotic red and blue flashes of the police lights strobing through the broken front door, throwing fractured, colorful reflections across the kitchen cabinets. It was the $10,000 trinket she had bought with the exact price of my freedom. You did not think of the family when you took Marcus' hush money, I said. My voice dropped to a flat, emotionless register that cut through her frantic hysterics like a surgical scalpel. You did not think of our reputation when you enthusiastically agreed to help him fabricate a narrative about my mental instability to your entire congregation. You were perfectly willing to let me be dragged away in a straitjacket. You were perfectly willing to let that woman lock your 5-year-old granddaughter in a dark room. You did not care about Zuri crying in the dark, but you expect me to care about Trey crying in a federal holding cell. Yvonne flinched violently as if I had physically struck her across the jaw. She shook her head frantically in denial, but the justifications died in her throat. The 3 women from her congregation were still huddled in the dining room. I could see them in my peripheral vision. They were watching their moral superior grovel on the floor, her hypocrisy and greed laid bare for them to witness. They were already whispering, their faces tight with judgment. Yvonne's social empire was burning to ash right in front of her most important peers. I reached down and gripped her wrists. My movements were slow, deliberate, and totally devoid of anger. I was handling her the way one might handle a contaminated piece of equipment. With steady, undeniable pressure, I pried her manicured fingers off my uniform skirt. She resisted for a fraction of a second, letting out a pitiful whine, before the absolute finality in my grip broke her remaining will. Her hands fell away, dropping limply into her lap. I took a single, precise step back permanently, severing the physical connection between us. I looked down at the pathetic, ruined shell of the tyrant who had terrorized me for decades. "You always wanted the family to be famous in this town, Mother," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the devastated living room, ensuring the church ladies heard every single undeniable syllable. "Tomorrow, you will be on the front page of every news station. Merry Christmas." I turned my back on her. I did not look at the shattered crystal wine glass on the floor, the ruined holiday catering on the marble island, or the terrified guests pressed against the walls. I kept my head high, my posture impeccable, and my gaze fixed straight ahead. The freezing winter wind whipped through the splintered frame of the front door, carrying the harsh crackle of police radios and the sharp, authoritative commands of federal agents securing their prisoners in the transport vehicles. I walked out of the house, my combat boots stepping cleanly over the broken wood, and out onto the front porch. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the suburban street, casting long, frantic shadows across the manicured lawns. I left the shattered remnants of the party behind me, the sound of my mother wailing on the hardwood floor fading into the chaotic noise of the raid. The crisp winter air outside the Beacon Hill house was a stark contrast to the suffocating toxicity I had just left behind. As I walked down the driveway, the flashing red and blue lights washing over the pristine snow, I did not look back. I had executed the objective, neutralized the threats, and secured my most precious asset. The mission was over. 6 months passed with the rapid, uncompromising efficiency of a military tribunal. The federal justice system, when handed a perfectly wrapped, mathematically precise package of undeniable digital evidence, does not move slowly. There were no drawn-out, dramatic courtroom battles. There were no tearful testimonies or shocking twists. The evidence I provided was absolute, and the consequences were brutally swift. Faced with the crushing weight of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft, both Marcus and Trey realized immediately that their arrogant game was over. They turned on each other within the first 48 hours, each desperately trying to secure a lighter sentence by throwing his brother under the bus. But the federal prosecutors did not need their cooperation. The digital trail of the forged power of attorney and the illegal transfer of funds across state lines was a closed loop of undeniable guilt. Stripped of their tailored suits, their country club memberships, and their unearned suburban prestige, the two brothers accepted blind plea deals rather than face a jury. They were both sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. There will be no early parole. There will be no corporate comebacks. Their lives as they knew them were entirely eradicated. Heather's reality check was equally severe, fueled by the sheer disgust of the prosecutors who viewed the security footage. The undeniable video of her physically assaulting Zuri and locking a terrified 5-year-old in a dark room guaranteed that no judge would show her an ounce of mercy. The stolen designer dresses and the arrogant smirks were replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit. She was sentenced to a hard 10 years in a state facility. Furthermore, a permanent injunction was filed legally barring her from ever working with, living with, or being in close proximity to children for the rest of her life. She thought she was stepping into a turnkey life. Instead, she locked herself in a cage. The collateral damage extended exactly where it needed to. Dr. Thorne, the arrogant, morally bankrupt psychiatrist, who was perfectly willing to trade his medical oath for a bribe to declare me unfit, found his career incinerated overnight. Armed with the financial records of Marcus's illicit payments to his private clinic, the medical board stripped Thorne of his license within weeks. He is currently facing his own federal indictment for medical fraud and conspiracy, his lucrative practice permanently shuttered. And then there was Yvonne. She was not federally indicted as she had technically not signed the forged bank documents, but the punishment she received was a fate she considered far worse than a prison cell. The exposure of her complicity broadcast live in front of the most prominent gossips of her congregation completely destroyed her social empire. The church ladies she had spent decades desperately trying to impress exiled her entirely. She was stripped of her committee titles, excluded from the Sunday brunches, and frozen out of the community she had sacrificed her own daughter to remain a part of. The pious, morally superior matriarch became a suburban pariah. She now lives in total isolation in her silent, empty house, utterly cut off from the daughter and granddaughter she betrayed for a shiny trinket. I did not stay in Massachusetts to watch them rot. The Beacon Hill property, despite its high market value and beautiful architecture, was permanently tainted ground. It held the echoes of betrayal and the memory of my daughter's tears. I put the house on the market the very next week. It sold quickly to the highest bidder in an all-cash transaction. I liquidated the asset entirely and transferred every single cent back into Zuri's secure, federally monitored, irrevocable trust. I closed that chapter of my life with the same absolute finality I used to close a completed mission file. A month later, my military command recognized my service, my tactical proficiency, and my unwavering leadership. I stood in front of my commanding officers and proudly pinned the golden oak leaves of a major onto my uniform. With the promotion came a new set of orders and a fresh start. I accepted a permanent transfer to a strategic command base on the sun-drenched coast of Southern California. The heavy, oppressive winters of New England are now nothing more than a distant memory. Today, the warm Pacific breeze carries the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. I am standing on the wooden deck of our new home, a bright, open house that overlooks a sweeping expanse of blue ocean. Down on the warm, golden sand, Zuri is running her joyful, uninhibited laughter, ringing out over the sound of the crashing waves. She is chasing a flock of seagulls, her little legs pumping, her face turned up toward the bright, cloudless sky. She is safe. She is deeply loved, and she will never again know the darkness of a locked room or the cruelty of people who view her as an inconvenience. If you are watching this and you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your worth is constantly minimized by the people who are supposed to protect you, hear me clearly. Family is not defined by shared genetics or a common last name. Blood does not grant someone a free pass to disrespect, manipulate, or abuse you. True family is built on loyalty, mutual respect, and unconditional protection. If the people at your dinner table are plotting your downfall, they are not your family. They are simply enemies who happen to know your birth date. Never be afraid to use the ultimate tactical advantage walking away. Secure your assets, know your worth, and never apologize for burning a bridge that leads directly to a toxic environment. Protect your peace, defend your loved ones with uncompromising ferocity, and define your own success. Have you ever had to permanently cut ties with toxic family members? To protect your peace, share your story in the comments below. If this journey of absolute justice resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over betrayal. Remember, your peace of mind is your most valuable asset. Defend it at all costs.